So over the past week, we've taken a look at plyometrics. That was originally our topic to discuss, and we found that plyometrics are very much specific to the sport that you're trying to do. So when you're working with plyometrics, it's being able to use your body in the particular way that it's needing to be. So if someone's trying to be a football player or someone's trying to be a basketball player, like their training protocols will be different. And so therefore plyometrics are very independent of that. If you're trying to be a long jumper, that's great. If you're trying to be a runner, that's great. And plyometrics can help. But the one thing that we did find is that when it comes to plyometrics really only need to be used about once every 2 weeks. It doesn't have to be anything more. And actually less doesn't find a lot of benefit. So we started looking into why plyometrics would be beneficial. And in doing so, we started looking into tendons. We're looking at stability and how everything creates structure. And we can build that through strength training, but we thought, what about tendons? We know that with muscles, you can create hypertrophy of the muscles. What about tendons? So when it comes to tendons, you can generate hypertrophy of tendons. It just takes a very, very long time. So the difference between muscle and tendon is tendon doesn't have a lot of blood. So that means not a lot of nutrition to it. It means not a lot of oxygen to it. So using tendons and building hypertrophy and growing those tendons takes a lot of time. And that's not saying, this is going to be an 8 to 12 weeks thing. We're talking years. So a lot of the studies that they did was on the knee extensor and the ankle flexor. So we found that a lot of the limitations weren't just the fact that they were working on knee extensors and ankle flexors, but also the time frame. Most of these studies were 8 to 12 weeks long, which meant that there wasn't any change when it came to cross-sectional analysis. So when they're measuring the thickness of the tendon, there wasn't a change over that time. There was one that I read that had something to do with, maybe 12 months down the line, you can start to see some change, but not really. So what changes when you do plyometrics, when you start loading those tendons? Well, the tendons start to change, not in thickness, but instead in structure. There's not a lot of explanation as to what that change is. We just know that what we're looking for is essentially tendon stiffness. We are looking for tendon stiffness to increase. And if you increase tendon stiffness, this allows for transfer of load to be a little bit better. Living here in Alaska, if we were going to pull somebody out of the ditch, we wouldn't want to use a bungee cord. There's too much springing action to pull that back. There's too much elasticity that towing somebody out with that is difficult. So if you use chains, really easy to get somebody out. You can just transfer that force straight on through. And so if we look at tendons the exact same way, by creating stiffness, we're able to transfer the load, where if we're going through a motion, like if we're running, per se, we're trying to create force. So as we run, we create force, and that load has to be transferred through the muscle to the foot. So we're pushing back, we're using the force generated from our muscles in the calf to create the propulsion that you need, and so you need a good stiff tendon to do so. So when we're looking at tendon stiffness, how do you make it better? So there were studies that looked at cardiovascular exercise like running, weightlifting, resistance training, plyometrics, and even just basic stretching. What they found is that, amazingly enough, resistance training is the best way to increase your tendon stiffness. Running did all right, but plyometrics really didn't do that well, and it makes actually a lot of sense. So when I talked about creating elasticity, when it comes to plyometrics, you're storing energy, right? You're jumping off of a box and you're landing on the ground, and you want to store that energy so you can jump again. When we're looking at plyometrics, we're not actually changing the structure of that tendon very much. We're keeping it actually pretty loose. So when it comes to plyometrics, you don't really want something that's stiff, but for pretty much anything else, you want more stiffness. So we have to be aware as to what the function of each of the muscles that we're doing. Do we want a stiff tendon or do we not? So if you want to have flexibility in your hips, you don't necessarily want these really tight tendons. You can still have some flexibility coming from good loose tendons. But if you're trying to go for a heavy squat, you don't want these loose tendons that are just going to have your joints pop out of place. We want good strength in the muscle carried through the chain, through those tendons into the next part of the body. So we learned through these studies that the best thing you can do to increase the health of your tendons, to increase the stiffness of your tendons, is to go ahead and do resistance training over plyometrics, over running, everything else. So tendons are documented to be able to store energy. They're pretty much that elastic band. So as tendons store energy, they create this stretch reflex. So if you're jumping, you can kind of create a little bit of a spring. You can create some stretch in that. So you have your foot and you have your leg, and as you land, you don't want to just have everything really stiff because you can start to tear stuff. So as you land, you want to be able to create a little bit of flexion. You can store that energy as you come down and you're able to spring back up. So when we look at running, we would think that we would want to have a lot of stretch. We'd want to have a point where your foot lands and you create a stretch and it pulls you back and it creates a lot of springing motion. But instead, what we want is a stiffer tendon. So that stiffer tendon can create force. That way, when we push with our leg, we don't have our ankle flopping around, right? If we create a lot of force and our foot lands, if we don't have a very strong tendon, then you'll just bounce like this. You won't actually have force generated. So everything that your quad's doing, everything that calf is doing to extend your leg, you're not gonna actually generate force. So that's why they saw stiffening in the tendons of runners as well. So when we start looking at what happens when a tendon gets injured, and due to the fact that there's not a lot of blood flow into tendons themselves, it takes a really, really long time to heal. So if you have a muscle tear, it'll take some time. It heals decently well. But when you have a tendon issue, when you tear a tendon, there's a couple things that happen. And in the first few days, there's just this really basic structure, that this protective structure that starts to form. It's not very strong, it's just there to do the very basic stuff. From that point on, there's another 3 weeks. And in those next 3 weeks is where the tendons actually start to generate a matrix of sorts to create structure and start forming things back together. And in that time, they start to align and start to figure out what their function is. And then over the next 6 to 12, even 18 months is where tendons start to actually come together and grow. And that's just, once again, due to the fact there's not a lot of blood flow. You can't supply nutrients there. You can't pull the byproducts out of that tendon rebuild. So when we're looking at recovery of tendon injuries, it takes a long time. Or if you're coming back from a surgery and you've had something torn, there's a long recovery process. And you have to take that into account when you're recovering from an injury, when you're recovering from a surgery. That sure, your muscles may be great, but your tendons aren't. Oftentimes, you'll see bodybuilders and you'll see people lifting heavy weights and they'll get tendon tears. And that's because muscles can grow faster than tendons. So when you're starting to put an excessive load from tendon to muscle to tendon, there's a higher likelihood that your muscle is growing faster than those tendons. So as that happens, your muscle gets really strong and you go to lift some really heavy weight and those tendons just are not strong enough. These tendons just cannot support the structure that's been built through the muscle. So in summary, tendon health is measured by stiffness. And except for a few particular sports like plyometrics and probably something like parkour, there's a reason to work on tendon stiffness. And that, from all the research that we looked at, primarily comes through resistance training. There was some increases in cross-sectional analysis when it came to a couple particular studies, but once again, these were long-term studies, but that only came from resistance training. So when you're looking to create healthier, stronger muscles, we also need to look at the tendons and make sure that we're not overloading the tendons and we're taking the time to let them build for proper strength. Whether you're a runner, whether you're a weightlifter, or you're just an average everyday person, that's what we're looking for. Another thing that they found is due to the lack of blood flow, even though the tendons can't grow or get super stiff really quickly, what that also means is that they don't degrade very quickly. So they put some test subjects on bed rest for 3 weeks. And of course, they saw muscle loss, they saw some atrophy, but what they didn't see is any loss in tendon stiffness. The tendons were still just as good as the day that they went in. So even though tendons don't have a lot of blood flow, they're still able to retain a lot of their structure. Something else that they found is in elderly populations, in just older populations in general, is tendons are much harder to build that stiffness, and they're much harder to build your hypertrophy of that tendon as you get older, just like with muscle, just like with anything else. But just like in the example of where bed rest patients had no reduction in their stiffness of their tendons, you're also able to build your structure of your tendons at an early age, and it lasts a long time. So if you're looking to create long-term health and longevity in your life, to do whatever it is you want to do, increasing your tendon stiffness is a good way to do so. So on our journey to bring more information and educate more people, we're also looking to educate ourselves. And in that, we're going to be expressing our thoughts and opinions as to what will be our next topic over the next week. So over the next week, we're going to be trying to figure out what the relationship is in hypertrophy and strength when it comes to muscle fiber types. So we've got type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers, your fast twitch fibers and your slow twitch fibers. And what role does that play when we're trying to train for strength? What does that mean? Which ones should we be working on? When it comes to hypertrophy, which ones should we be working on? Is there a way to properly train a muscle group because of their muscle fiber composition? So all muscles have both for type 1 fibers and type 2. Does that ratio matter? Is that too variant in people to really know? So our entire concept for the next week is to try to figure out and tell all of you what the difference is between muscle fiber types and how to properly train for them.